Yeah.
Okay, should we start? Hello, everyone. Hi.
I think, yeah, sorry, there was a bit up there saying admit. I suppose you'll be doing the admitting, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yes, that's okay. Okay, she's everyone in now.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which is launching the book, What is Artificial Intelligence? A conversation between an AI engineer and a humanities researcher. My name's Natalia, and I'll be introducing things and moderating the Q&A session later. The webinar is going to last for about an hour. We're going to hear from our authors, Suman and Peter too, who will tell us a bit about the book and also explore some of the ideas that they talk about in the book. Towards the end, we'll have about 20 minutes for you to ask any questions you might have. And you can ask your questions at any time, just put them in the chat and I'll be checking them as we go along. So the next thing to talk about is the housekeeping rules, which you should be able to see on your screen. So the most important thing is please make sure that you are muted and turn your camera off if possible for the entire event. Thank you. If you have any comments or questions or problems, do just write them in the chat and I'll be watching that, as I mentioned before. And finally, just a quick note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to the public afterwards. The last thing then that I need to do before handing over to our authors is just introduce them. So we have Suman, who has studied English at the universities of Delhi and Oxford before going into academia, working in several universities, including having visiting positions pretty much all over the world, I think. He is now Professor of Literature and Cultural History at the Open University. Then we have Peter, who studied at the University of Waterloo in Canada and also Oxford, which I think you'll hear about a little bit more later. He's currently Chief Scientist for Artificial Intelligence at General Electric, where he's been working for some time on various different projects. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to our authors.
Great. So I'll start off with a bit of an introduction of how we came to this book, and then I'll hand off to Suman to give his opening thoughts on the book in general, and then I will follow up with a response on those general thoughts, if that's amenable. So just a little bit how we got to where we're going. Basically, Suman and I were grad students at Oxford University. We were cohabitating for a while at a place called Exeter College, a place called Exeter House, run by Exeter College, which was where the graduate students were put up. The way we basically spent our days is, at least the way I understood it, was Suman would go off to the Bodleian Library and read, n number of books, and I would scuttle off to my lab and write n number of algorithms on my computer. We would come home. He would explain the various things that are going on in the library, and I would explain what I was doing with my computers and my colleagues. This would inevitably end up with some sort of conversation regarding all sorts of topics, but a lot of it was to do with our work. When it came to things to do with artificial intelligence, we both had, interestingly enough, very strong ideas on this topic, both from the humanities side as well as from the engineering or AI research side. And usually these conversations ended with something along the lines of me saying, Suman, you don't have enough math to understand what I say, or I'm saying, and Suman saying, Peter, you're not sufficiently well read to understand what I'm saying. And this would usually, that was the general run-of-the-mill, of course, for our conversations. We enjoyed these conversations nonetheless, and over the years continued to do so whenever we were on the same continent. The last time I was in London, I rang Suman up and we decided to meet at the Putney Pie restaurant. And once again, our conversation continued much as like it was 30 years ago. But at the end of the conversation, we thought, well, why don't we put our conversation in blog form? I think both of us had the suspicion that we might be able to better pin the other one down a little bit more, if you will. I'm not sure if that actually happened or not, but at the same time, we rather enjoyed the mutual blogging process. It was kind of a meandering affair, if you will. None of us, we weren't planning exactly what we were going to talk about. We just let the discussion go where it went. At some point, we thought, well, maybe this actually constitutes enough material to put to a book together. And dare I say, here we are today. Suman, maybe I can hand it off to you if you want to make any comments on the introduction, and then maybe your opening comments about the book in general.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Yeah, the time in Oxford and our conversations, they were interesting because one realized that living with Peter and sharing anything with Peter, like a pie, for example, in Putney Pies, is a negotiation. And Peter wants the lion's share. And most of the time, you have to rationalize and try to push him into a corner to get an equal share. You would never get a larger share, but you could aspire to an equal share. It's hard work. Which means, I think, that everything Peter says after I've done my piece should be taken with skepticism. That's something I've learned. Never take him for granted. Give him an inch and he'll take a mile. So anything he says might be true, but it also might not be. And that's pretty much where our conversation starts from. This is usually how it has worked when we have tried to talk about, when I've tried to find out a bit more about artificial intelligence, very far from being my field. The Bodleian Library is not really set out to teach artificial intelligence, and not any of the other places I've been. But nevertheless, the ideas that Peter explains to me, and they're tremendously interesting ideas, always impress me. So if Peter tells me how he goes about trying to get an automatized system to recognize a face, what sort of algorithms are involved, what sort of primary considerations are involved, what sort of preliminary definitions of a face or of recognition is involved, and how that process unrolls from a preliminary set of ideas towards something that works and functions. I find myself tremendously impressed. I say, wow, that is so clever. Such ingenuity has gone into it. And yet, at the same time, while I recognize this and I'm sort of starry-eyed with admiration, at the same time, I have this little prickle of doubt. And the doubt is not that this isn't intelligent and it's not doing what it claims to do, but is it being presented to suggest what it actually does? So there's a difference, for instance, in saying at the very most basic level that this kind of technology is artificial intelligence and people understanding what that means. And that's pretty much where we began, where this book begins from, the concept of intelligence, which I've always found a particularly nebulous and slippery concept. And yet, we have this set of technological capacities and resources, which Peter explains very, very lucidly at times, which we are accustomed to think of as intelligent, which we are constantly told are intelligent, in which there's a gigantic industry persuading us that it's intelligent, and in which there's a great deal of propaganda pushing for us to sort of concede its intelligence. So that means we are pressed to understand what intelligence is, which is, I realized when I started thinking about it, quite a difficult thing to do. We are okay at being to greater or lesser degrees intelligent ourselves, or thinking we are, but to actually try to define that term, to pin down, to identify at what point a particular capacity has stepped into the realms of intelligence is a quite different thing. And in this, the technological dimension, the dimension in which things are being made to work so that they seem to be labelable as intelligent, is not quite the same as how we understand it as being intelligent. So to explain that, to say that one can, that a particular instrument can recognize a face might give us the impression that it's doing something similar to what we do when we say, I recognize a face. But we are pressing the term recognize there in different ways. In one, there is a very particular set of functions and outputs that are understood as recognition, whereas for us, recognition is a far more nebulous and hazy idea, which we do, which we think we knew, but which are hard-pressed to define. So in a way, the terms are where I begin from. Language is what I'm interested in, and the terms are where I begin from. What does it mean to be intelligent? Is what is being labeled intelligent quite the same as what we preconceived as intelligent? Is recognition in the technical sense quite the same as what it means when I say, I recognized Peter walking in the crowd, for example? These are different sorts of recognition, I think, or at least we need to check whether they're quite the same thing. When one does this, and when I started doing this, it seemed to me that there are factors other than the technical at play. As I said, there's an industry behind it. There are political interests, there are policy interests, which are discussed at some length in the book. And these interests are not just going by the rationale of making the thing work for a particular end. They have other interests behind them. Making money is an interest, for example. Exercising power is an interest. Trying to grab your attention by way of propaganda is an interest. And these interests are not necessarily the same as the technical one, and they might well interfere in there. And they often do, I think. In fact, I begin to suspect at times that even the use of the word intelligence in artificial intelligence serves interests which are larger than the technical apparatus that Peter and his peers would be developing. And that's at least an idea I wanted to push. And that takes the book, after various meanders, into the question of policy, which occupies the latter part of the book. And policy is an interesting thing because one of the points we start from is how do we recognize that a given set of capacities, an instrument, a gadget, a system that is automatized is in fact an entity in the sense we think of ourselves as intelligent entities? How do we do that? How do we know that that's a person? And it occurred to me, as indeed it has occurred to many other people, that a person is not necessarily intrinsically defined. We have a set of rules. A corporation is a person, for instance, though a corporation is not a person in the sense that Peter and I are persons. Nevertheless, legally, the corporation is a person, in some ways behaving as if it is an individual like Peter or I. And that's an interesting thing. And if one goes through the mechanics of that, it seems to me that it's possible, it might come to pass, that a set of capacities, a system, an automatized system, might become a person, much like you and I, enjoying legal rights, irrespective of its intrinsic qualities. And that's a conundrum. That's a conundrum that needs to be cracked. It's a conundrum that appears elsewhere. I mean, it has come up, for instance, with regard to animal rights, but that's more understandable. Machine rights or artificial entity rights, electronic agent rights, which are being widely discussed, are somewhat different, a distinct thing. And that, in a way, that points to that split that occupies some of my thinking and some of our debates in that book, that the thing that is being constituted as an artificial agent and the manner in which that's being presented, accommodated in the social and political world are not necessarily coherent and continuous. There are slippages in there, and those slippages need attention. Attention begins with words, looking at words. At the moment, for instance, I'm wondering whether that can't be stretched quite far. Can I actually declare a cabbage, for example, as a legal person? Where does the boundary stop? To what quality is it of an automatized system which actually contains legal personhood? Is there an objective constitutive element in there which can be pinned down in that fashion? Having said all that, I think I'll pass it back to Peter for the time being, because Peter will, of course, refute everything. That's the whole point. Peter will disagree with everything I say, and then I'll come back and I'll disagree with everything he says, and we'll probably write another book along those lines in due course. So back to you, Peter.
Thank you once again for your grace and candor, if you will. Yeah, I mean, I think the frustration with the way AI has been characterized is also felt by those who are practitioners of the art, if you will. I always like to start with where I think AI was, where it is, and where it may be going, and thus try to discuss in those terms. So, generally speaking, AI has been described in terms of three stages. One is a very specific stages or capabilities. One is at stage one, or the first stage, has generally been viewed as the exploitation of knowledge, which is to say that knowledge could be in the form of predicates or rules or things that we know that we could then combine. So things like A is a B and B is a C, therefore A is a C. This was found to be very brittle in terms of the consistency of that knowledge and the ability to make nuanced interpretations of it. I think this led to the AI winter, which followed by the next wave of AI, which I would characterize as statistical inference. And the argument here is not so much is this an intelligent element anymore, but can we argue that the world itself is characterized by what we would call statistical distributions? We can observe certain things X, and we hope to derive certain other values that aren't directly observable Y. So if I see an image of a cow, I want to know that it is a cow. All I see is the pixels associated with the cow, but not the label of cow. And to that extent, we've made significant strides in this capacity of, given large numbers of X's and Y's, can we infer Y given X? But once again, would you consider that intelligent? And Suman makes the argument that face recognition itself, although maybe impressive, but so is a clock for that matter. And does it leap the gap between a fine machination versus an actual leap to what we'd consider intelligence? And once again, that slippery term keeps coming up. I think where things start to get more interesting is the aspirations of AI, if you will. And there we start to get closer to what maybe Suman might consider as intelligence or at least the quest thereof. And that's generally described as the third wave of AI. Which is still unfolding as we speak. But the general aspirations of the third wave are more or less along the lines of, can we have agents or entities that can, given unforeseen circumstances, more or less get the gist of things and then do the right thing. That's sort of, I agree those are nebulous terms, but I think it goes beyond the question of purely statistical inference and knowledge management. I mean, those statistical inference and knowledge management may be parts of those general capabilities, but that's sort of the goal, if you will, going forward, I would argue. I think what's interesting about the book is that we can then sort of probe how that third wave might unfold, if you will. So one of the areas that Suman proposed as well, what would it take to create an intelligent Pac-Man player, Pac-Man being the popular video game. And so in there we discuss a number of things, but I think it sort of comes down to an idea of what needs to be learned as an agent over the lifetime of a species, things like perception, memory, learning. Then I would argue that there comes down to things that must be learned over historical times, language, social norms, cooperation. And then finally, what would it take for an entity over a lifetime to capture? Things like unsupervised experience, natural language acquisition, being able to speak an English or Latin, if you will. The grounding problem comes to mind, which is to say, what do these objects actually mean? And ultimately, you might even argue some sort of self-awareness, if that's possible. But I think ultimately, what plagues the AI world is the problem that much of the philosophical questions are yet to be answered, and as Suman points out, are so poorly defined. And so they become what I would call sort of the elephants in the room. We we tiptoe around them. We can, while we're very comfortable about talking about statistical inference, we're very hesitant to discuss in any sort of fluid manner what self-awareness might constitute, or how we might get there, or what it means. And so I think the book helps us by kicking the tires, if you will, around these potholes that, if not addressed, will forever limit where we're going. So the book, I would argue, also goes on after discussing Pac-Man as well. Supposing we are to be able to make this intelligent Pac-Man player, how would we know if we were playing an intelligent Pac-Man player? A kind of variation of the Turing problem. It seems to be acting intelligently, therefore it's intelligent. That was sort of the model there. Whereas John Searle would argue against that considerably, in terms of suggesting that even though it acts in a certain way, or it appears to act in a certain way, the way it works is actually more important than how it works, if you will. Or the outcomes of or the observations of its performance. And so we decided, well, what would it take to know whether or not we were dealing with an imposter intelligent Pac-Man player versus a true one? And we sort of come to the question of Pac-Man itself may not necessarily be the answer. It's the question of the desire to play Pac-Man, given that the designers didn't know that Pac-Man existed. Could you create something that has a sense of intentionality? And that was an idea there. What struck me along these lines of these discussions also was, and it always surprises me at the end of every blog, is what concept Suman decided to take issue with at the next turn in our discussions. I thought a relatively innocuous question. Well, it seems to me an interesting question of whether or not creativity and how that might emerge in certain things, at which Suman took, quite a bit of concern about my use of the term and how it's been described in other books and so forth. And so that led to a large discussion of what we consider to be creative processes, whether or not whether symbiosis is an act of creation versus the underpinnings of a good metaphor. Is that intrinsically creative or not? So these are areas that I think were worth discovering, or at least like I say, considering as we go forward. It led us also discussions of what it might take to grow an intelligent agent. And I thought this was an interesting area that goes from where we are today to just purely on a computational perspective. What could we do? So could we redo the human experiment, if you will? And after discussing this for a while, I did a back of the envelope calculation, and if we had a very aggressive doubling of computer power every year, which is sort of the hope, but not necessarily the reality, one could maybe imagine in 50 years from now, we could redo the whole problem within a matter of 3 months. This is obviously very, very exciting, but maybe somewhat far-fetched. But I think the conclusion also comes down to it is that even though you have the capacity to redo an evolutionary process, whether or not we actually get to where what we think is intelligent was not obvious. And the idea is that intelligence may not necessarily be inevitable, if you will. So, the question is, at the end of the first part is, how can we know if we are making progress towards what may or may not be considered as intelligence? So a number of thoughts came to mind. People have written about the idea of creative copying, the sense that an agent may be able to observe a capability such as flight, but not be able to do it the way it was done, and thus be able to come up with a new way of performing flight. Explainable knowledge, not science, but more, can I explain how that happened? And maybe more importantly, criticism. Could an agent actually not just propose a solution or an idea, but criticize or provide an argument for why that's not a particularly good idea and stuff like that? So these are hallmarks that I would at least look for whether or not something that what we might consider intelligent, whether we're making progress in that direction. We talked a lot about what it would be to be a responsible agent. My general feeling at the end of the day is that this may come down to a question of shame, of responsibility. But then the question is, well, how can you create an artificial sense of shame, if you will? And then once again, that I think leads us back to the grounding problem, which still remains a conundrum for the research problem. Grounding meaning what do these objects, what do these entities really mean, if you will, and how do we gather meaning from them? But is it just a matter of symbol manipulation for an AI system? So I think those were interesting topics to follow in that regard. We talked about the question of, in terms of policy, data is certainly driving much of the research today. As we say, especially if you're looking at inference problems, you can use relatively straightforward algorithms given sufficient data to represent the problem. And then the question is, well, who owns the data? Who provides access to the data? How does one manipulate the data? Is data a crutch? I mean, these are topics that we consider quite seriously, I think. At the end of this section, on terms of the policies and questions, well, what are the dangers of supposing we are successful in creating this sort of general artificial intelligence, whatever that might be? What are the dangers there, and more or less, what are the repercussions, especially when it comes to the workforce and so forth? So we both had our ideas on whether or not this is a question of policy versus technology, and I think my general feeling is that it is a mixture of both, if not more policy than technology. But finally, also, is what are the dangers of not going down this path? Do we need an artificial intelligence that we hope to get? Are we not equipped for our own technology today? Do we need an inoculation towards fake news, if you will? Do we need systems that will help us deal with the climate change problems that are coming at us in a big way? Are we living in existential times? And if so, do we need that kind of new technology that AI might bring to us? So those are the various topics that we discussed along the way. So I enjoyed once again, not necessarily that we came to any conclusions, but once again, the kicking of the tires, I think, opens up the path towards doing the type of research that we need to go for. And without this kind of discussion, I think we are forever limited in a very small area of research, and once again, as Suman points out, the criticism that propaganda can go out there, people can be misled in terms of what is done and what can be done versus what actually is being done. And I think that's an important question to be going forward. So those are my general thoughts on the book. Natalia or Suman, maybe I pass it back to you for rebuttal, if you will.
No rebuttal. I thought that was a very useful summary of what we actually did. Just wanted to add a point there. A horizon of this discussion, in my view, is that the way in which we think about AI is that it's something happening out there, that we are trying to constitute some kind of functional entity, which will serve certain purposes for us. But it's out there, whatever this is, a system, an entity, an agent, however we think about it. But to a large extent, this process of trying to constitute, imagine, think this thing is also a reconstitution of ourselves. And that's something that comes up occasionally throughout the book. And in fact, that's critical both to the policy section and to the first one. So even a question like what is intelligence, what is recognition, what is classification, is both a pinning down of a concept that can be functionally implemented within a system out there, but it's also a clarification or at least an interrogation of concepts which we entertain for understanding ourselves. So to some extent, thinking about AI is also a confrontation with social and political realities around us, which in a way dovetails nicely into where Peter was ending there. Do we need something to be able to tack fake news, for example? But fake news is being produced by us, and maybe fake news is fake because we have this capacity to spread news in a particular way. So in a way, the capacity that is being technologically implemented is also modifying us as a social collective, as a species, as a collective intelligence, or even as an individual intelligence. Maybe we are living our lives differently. Maybe the AI is constituting us in particular ways as people. And that's the horizon which I think it's difficult to say where AI ends as an empirical, objective thing out there, and where it actually is that because we are changing ourselves, constituting ourselves anew with lots of new data as we enter this process. So I just wanted to put that there as a kind of horizon to our conversation. Yeah. And that takes us back to Natalia, if still there.
Yeah. Hello. Well, thank you very much for that part of the webinar. You gave us a lot to think about, and so I guess we can now move on to the questions. And I'd like to remind you all to keep your questions coming in the chat room. We've had a few, but we have quite a lot of time now to answer all of your questions. So do remember to do that. I'd like to start off with, so Peter, you mentioned that you thought the book would be useful was sort of kicking tires. I just wanted to know whether this format of discussion in this way, especially with someone from very much outside the field, is new, and what it brings in particular.
Right, that's a good question. So my general view on sort of AI books, if you will, or AI is that generally speaking, they're written from a single person's perspective. They may be considering the views of others, but one person essentially marshals the direction with which that conversation goes. This usually has a planned field. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and a culmination of the conclusions reached at the end are essentially, to a large degree, supported by the book itself. Whereas I think this idea of a dyadic process, if you will, a conversation between people from different fields, has that quality of taking us into places that neither of us really expected to go. I use that term meandering as a kind of river that it may start off going in a direction, but can quickly take a left turn and a right turn. And where I think that's interesting is that it's a situation now where I have to now consider topics that I may not have put much thought into, because I'm around maybe like-minded individuals most of the day. And at some point, getting discussions with people who are not like-minded, but have different perspectives and different views, that forces me to reconsider my position. It forces me to either buttress or abandon a thought. But I think what it revolves in essentially is an evolution, an interesting evolution, that to me takes us to more interesting conversations and interesting discussions. And so I think that's what the advantage of having this type of discussion, if you will. The other element I would add in there from a more of a personal perspective is that I would say that AI research is quite interesting in that we are somewhat shameless with our muses, if you will. We're always looking for a new inspiration. Maybe the neuroscientists have found some clever thing. A physicist may have come up with something. Maybe a cognitive scientist has come up with some formulation. It is somewhat ruthless in the sense of if it works, if we can make a computational model from it, then we will go forward. So I would argue that what discussions with Suman and other folks like him, that brings us into contact with other people who have thought about these weighty problems in a different way, in a different capacity. And once again, there's always that hope that this is a different insight now that I can now take to my advantage in terms of inspiration for new research, if you will. So those are the comments I would have on that. Suman, maybe you want to comment on that?
Yes, but very similar actually. I'm also opportunistic in my own research, so I do look for that little spark of connections, which might be fortuitous, which I didn't expect, but which will emerge unexpectedly from the conversation. But the conversation, of course, has its own dynamic, and that dynamic is, for me, and I think for both of us, and possibly for others, it is entertaining to begin with. I think I actually do enjoy trying to pin down ideas and throwing the ball out there and seeing how it bounces. So there is the entertainment aspect of it. And there's also the fact that there is, as Peter said, there is an unpredictable quality about it, which, unlike most books, which are planned in advance and which a publisher would want a fairly comprehensive, coherent, planned out appearance to. Writing a proposal is often a declaration of how well you have planned everything, whereas this was an unplanned process. But conversations do play a much larger role, possibly, in research than the end product suggests. We are always making out that research leads to something that is sort of well formulated and reached a conclusion, where we have examined the field and we have reached a resolution of some kind. And there's a finished quality about this book. But we know that research never really finishes. We just keep prodding away at the problem and discovering new things. And by and large, research itself is a gigantic conversation in which each intervention looks complete, but we know it isn't because nothing is ever really finished. So in a way, there's a kind of immediacy about the form of the conversation, which I thought was interesting and productive, especially for a topic as open and as multi-sided as artificial intelligence.
The next question then is, what would both of you say on the marriage between AI and biotechnology, and do you think it would lead to a utopia of sorts or something quite the opposite? Let's start with Suman.
Right. There's a section of the book in which we talk about the possibility of what does artificial mean, and to what extent is artificial and a replication of an organic process, which is where I think biotechnology would largely belong. An intervention in an existing system of organic entities interacting with each other, a biological sphere. And the biological sphere can either be itself, it can be an inspiration which is replicated in some other form, or it can be molded and guided in its own way to create a kind of, let's say, further, almost a eugenicist kind of notion of a new entity. In fact, I'm not sure how to respond to that. I'm not sure that we think of artificial intelligence as separate from biotechnology, and I think the relation is quite complex. It is an analogous model, the biological sphere. At times, it is itself constitutive within, and there are parts of artificial intelligence research, I believe, which actually are directly within the organic sphere. So I'm not sure that there is, in my view, and so far as I understand that question, there is actually a wedding. It is more a kind of set of parallel, overlapping spheres of research, which speak to each other, which merge into and sometimes flow away from each other. Utopias wouldn't appear, I don't think, from either side by their own steam. There isn't an intrinsic utopian direction. There isn't a teleology in research on either side or in the sphere altogether. That is more a matter of enactments, I would say, rather than something that will appear spontaneously and automatically from any kind of scientific or other research.
Well, let me jump in then on that. So maybe I'll take it from a slightly different angle. I take Suman's point about the regards of whether these spheres are different or skew, if you will. I view biology itself as an interesting place, essentially, in that, it is the part of the physical world. It is not manufactured. It is real, if you will. I view a lot of what I would consider biological knowledge as interesting, in sense that. So let me talk about it in terms of a more general term. Say the DNA that we have got today that creates eyeballs, for instance. So eyeballs are very interesting. They work extremely well. It wasn't exactly clear how they got to where they are, but there are 7 billion of us have 2 eyeballs and they work very well. The DNA that creates those eyeballs, however, doesn't really explain how the eye works. It is just an encoding for how to create an eyeball, if you will. So what I would argue is biological knowledge is that it has been acquired through various processes to enable certain capabilities, but not necessarily to explain certain capabilities. So when I consider what as compared to sort of the biology of creating an eyeball, I would consider what a human might do in terms of a explainable knowledge would be the field of optics, for instance. So as opposed to encoding how to create an eyeball, optics tells us how light works, how lenses work, and so forth. And then from that type of knowledge, which I'd call more explainable knowledge, we get the capacity to construct microscopes, cameras, all sorts of other things that provide capabilities that the DNA itself may not be able to tell us what to do or how to do. It just tells us essentially a recipe for constructing a device. Now we have explainable knowledge would, to me, allow us to go beyond just constructing things, but why things happen the way they are. So I'm not suggesting that AI can do this today, but if AI can achieve the level of explanation, not just how to do something, but why something works, then I see the merger of the two coming together in some senses. If the capacity to explain why certain processes are happening, as opposed to how to discovering a method for achieving a certain capability, then I think we might go beyond just producing recipes for doing things, but understanding a deeper understanding for why things work the way they do. And if that's the case, then I think you could see some interesting evolutions in terms of the commingling of these capabilities. The idea of not just biological knowledge, but also explainable knowledge. And if that's the case, then we might be into some interesting times.
Can I chip in there? Because that reminded me, Peter, while you were talking there, that I was recently reading an article, for example, on the Human Genome Project and how that came about, this entire mapping of the genome sequence. And this article was arguing with strong claims that if this were done, it would lead to a possible resolution of a large number of medical problems.
Right.
That the health of the human species would be improved. Medical science would make a quantum leap of some kind. This article was arguing that this is not necessarily the case. Yeah. That being able to sequence, which is essentially a genetic description, being able to describe the human being at a molecular level, which is what a genome description actually is, doesn't mean that you would necessarily thereby be able to cure all diseases, because you have to understand disease. And disease is a very interesting thing, because a disease doesn't follow a norm. A person can be abnormal in some sense. Your heart could be on the right side rather than the left, but that doesn't mean you're diseased or you're unhappy. And that doesn't need to be corrected. So what is corrected to a large extent is kind of socially and individually determined and doesn't depend on how well you describe it. So I suppose biotechnology's aspirations, and the Genome Project is a good one, because that is then followed by the possibility of gene editing, having the CRISPR kind of mechanism. All of these are descriptive analytical capacities within the biotechnological sphere, which might reach towards objectives which we think they should be going for, but there isn't a necessary match. They're not as straightforward. Knowing the thing doesn't mean you know what the disease is. Right. And disease is a quite different sort of concept. So yes, it's precisely those little slippages which I think makes this sort of thing interesting. And that applies also to artificial intelligence. Knowing how a thing works doesn't mean that we necessarily know how well it functions.
Right. Agreed.
Well, thank you for that. The next question is, algorithmic categorization has been seen to be very different from human classification systems dependent on stable symbols. So the person asking this question says that to them, the question of working with and on algorithmic systems depends on interfaces. Have you both had a talk about interfaces and how stable or not it needs to be for this technology to evolve within our current governmental and political system?
Do you want me to take the first run at this one, Suman?
Yes, go on then.
Right. So, from my view, as a practitioner in the space of AI research, I think we're into an interesting time of democratization. What I mean by that is a large number of entities are essentially offering platforms for free. They're giving things like TensorFlow, PyTorch, whatever. Especially in the realm of deep learning, has seen a situation where a large number of algorithms are being made available to the general public. And we discussed this a little bit in the book. Where I think that goes is two interesting things. One, it opens up the possibility of a large number of people being able to use these techniques. What I find, though, is that one of the areas with which you can use a tool, but there are limits to how far you can go with that. So is what I would consider bespoke AI research, where you are into a difficult problem where you have to both understand the domain and maybe understand the assumptions behind the algorithm. So if you don't understand both, then I think you will be limited to, you're basically reduced to trying the algorithm out on the data and seeing if it works. And if it doesn't, then you move on to the next problem. And so what I think that kind of democratization has given access to algorithms through APIs and so forth, but it doesn't resolve the fundamental problem is that if the algorithm works, it works great. But if it doesn't, then what do you do? And an API doesn't really help you with that, I think. And so what I believe is going on a lot of the time now is that there are people who know what the catalog of capabilities are, but are willing to try to make use of those capabilities wherever it's profitable, but there are limits to how far the actual capability is going to get better, because I don't think it will if all you are is accessing it through the API. So I'm a little bit concerned about what I call sort of the oxygen leaving the room, if you will. So if maybe this is maybe more self-preserving than anything else, but I would suggest that I think it's good that we create stable systems that people can take advantage of through interfaces. But I also think if we stop moving the research forward, then I think then we will be stuck with just trying out the toys we have found, as opposed to moving into the things that we talk about in the third wave, which is Suman and I have discussed. How do we solve fundamental problems such as creativity and awareness and so forth. So that would be my concern. I think on one hand, I think it's great that people can have access to these tools and can use them, but I think there are limits to how far you can go with just generic application of generic algorithms to problems.
Yeah, and I agree with all that, and just wanted to underline very briefly, bit skeptical of the idea that algorithms are out there and that in itself will generate some kind of momentum of social and political change. I don't think that will happen. As Peter says, these are tools, and these tools are A, designed, and B, used within the limits of their preconceived functionality. And that is the point we go into in the book. Data is not collected ad nauseum out there. We collect data with some kind of notion of parameters for which the data would be used. One can collect infinite amounts of data, but that doesn't mean that that is a comprehensive set of data that describes everything. Ultimately, data is limited by the function to which it will be tested. And similarly with the tool has to serve a purpose. If one is going to do facial recognition, which is a discussion Peter and I had recently, we have to have an idea of what the recognition is for. If it is to identify a person from a pool of persons, that's quite different from what we do by way of recognition, but we can design a tool for that purpose. So tools by their existence and the frames of data by their existence limit the scope of what is possible. And I think what Peter was saying there, rightly, absolutely, is that one needs to start with not what we have, but more of what we have in different ways, as it were. So to start with the fundamental questions and to ask quite different kinds of questions, not to just say that we'll take one kind of capacity and one sort of data collection forward to ever greater intensity and depth and breadth, but to start new kinds of data collection and new kinds of tools, and even ask whether the tool function is the one we are stopping at, which ultimately is an important question in this area.
Thank you. The next question is, do you think that AI will further propel social or cultural divides or actually bridge them? Let's start with Suman.
Yes, and I'm always doubtful that AI will do anything. I don't think AI in itself, as you said, it's basically a set of capacities which serve the purposes that we imagine or conceive of them for and then functionalize them towards. So the existence of a capacity wouldn't actually, if we wanted to make a capacity to make a more equal society or a fairer distribution arrangements in the social sphere, then AI could be designed to that end. So I'm inclined to think that AI is a slight misnomer. That is why we started with that intelligence. It is not quite an autonomous agent determining a pathway for humanity. I think that's still in the sphere of fantasy. It is still a set of tools which has been given a somewhat optimistic name by being named intelligent, which serve the purposes that we imagine for it. So the frame of the question, which says that will AI lead to this, has already preconceived an agent status for AI, which doesn't necessarily gel with what that system at present consists in. So that's a very brief response. Peter will have a more considered response to that.
Right, certainly. Well, I think beyond AI, technology in general has always been a situation where it makes the powerful more powerful, in my general opinion, right? The people who can best exploit a technology are the ones who have the resources to exploit it, and that's generally, has been the case. And we've seen the last 30 years with technological advances, we have seen an inordinate amount of concentration of capital and so forth, because those who have the capital are the best able to take advantage of whatever new capabilities are out there. So if you argue that AI could be in terms of rapid trading, for instance, if speculators are able to trade at a faster rate with a slight more advantage in terms of predictive capability, then they'll be the ones who take advantage of that. So that's one consideration, is like I say, the people who have resources can take better advantage of new technologies because they have the resources. But there's the other element of the idea of democratization in general, as we talked before, in a slightly different sense. The bicycle, for instance, liberated a large number of people. They could now go, instead of 4 miles in a day, they could go 20 miles in a day, and that had a liberating experience, if you will. The match also comes to mind, as no longer are we tethered to starting fires as our main main effort of the day, if you will, becomes trivial. Dishwashers, clothes washers, whatever the things that liberate people from drudgery, if you will. I view those things as generally good and possibly more plural in terms of its utility for the populations. Where I think maybe I'll end this part in terms of what Suman was mentioning before, is the symbiotic nature of AI might be interesting. We talked a little bit about I've always been fascinated with the relationship of people and dogs, for instance. It has been argued that historically speaking, we'll just speculate here, is that by living with dogs, we may have been able to give up certain responsibilities and to the dog, and vice versa, be able to concentrate on other things. And so I sort of see the possibility of AI is taking on some of that cognitive load, if you will. We see things, for instance, GPS, for instance. Now, none of us, or many of us, no longer can read a map anymore, nor do we need to read a map. We just have our GPS system do it for us, if you will, or navigate, if you will, through a street. So, that's a somewhat, impressive, but in some ways not really intelligent per se, but it takes some of the burden from our existence away from us. So I could argue that if AI can reach its promise, could we come up with a deeper link between people and their AIs in a way that liberates us from some of the things that we don't want to do, and maybe enabling us to do other things? So I see it on both sides. One is AI makes the rich richer. On the other hand, AI may also be able to liberate us from things that we do not want to do and allow us to do things that we do want to do. So that's the plus and minus of this space.
Yeah, but that sounds sort of balanced. It's both this and that. But I must say, I feel quite resistant when people start talking about the liberatory factor and the freedom that will come with things. And so on, the cycle freed people, maybe. The cycle was produced in large numbers so that people could buy them. The process that enriches is also the process that puts out a kind of discourse of freeing people by selling the product. Were people less free before the bicycle? It's a question to be examined. It's not that clear that people were necessarily less free. That people always wanted to travel at a faster speed than a slower speed. It's a matter of how the social context works out. So I think the upbeat terminology, which we do fall into, liberation, etc., which we pin down on the instrument itself, rather than the productive processes and the manner in which it's sold. There are questions, and that's one of the things I tend to be skeptical of. The upbeat term. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Thank you. We have an observation that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. So in the late 19th century, the fear was that industrial technology turned human beings into machines. Today, the fear is of digital technology becoming human by acquiring human qualities such as intelligence. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I do, because that's kind of one of the arguments I was pursuing there, that it's not clear whether data is being used to replicate or whether we are becoming led by data ourselves. I mean, there is quite a significant bit of research on the idea of data selves. It even came up in an advertisement. Some insurance company, I think, put it out that knowing your data self is essentially knowing your financial history. But more seriously, there is a tendency to use, for example, data-led apps to constantly monitor and regulate your life, whether that's in terms of maintaining your home or checking out how many calories you have lost when you have walked or how people are responding to you. So there's a whole kind of set of constituting data which are constantly being fed to us as a product. And we model our actions to some degree by responding. So if I've run 15 miles and I burned so many calories, and tomorrow I want to run a bit more and burn a few more calories, and we have a data norm which might tell you what is the ideal calorie intake burning that you should be doing and what you should look like and so on. So there is an idea that we constitute our lives in terms of data, and the idea of the data self was gathering traction before it lost its way, I think, around the financial crisis. What I'm trying to say is that in many ways is analogous to the 19th century fear that people are turning into machines and people are turning into their data sets, is an argument that we hear constantly, that we are responding to our data, that we vote according to how we are targeted by using algorithms which are based on the data we put out there, that most of our actions are actually being predetermined by some kind of crunching of big data. What was that? I was watching this television series the other day, Dev. I don't know if you've seen it. Same chap who wrote The Beach. Dev, it seems to make out that if you have a comprehensive data set, you can basically model the whole world from beginning to end at the same time. A pure fantasy, but this idea, the fear that data is somehow constituting us and we are becoming the functions of our data. It seems to me it's not dissimilar to the 19th century idea that people are becoming machines.
Mm. Well, let me stop you on that. So that people are becoming machines. I would. I mean, one of the other topics in the book we discussed along these ideas is that whether or not people are you could say did industrialization dehumanize people. I would also argue that exposure to the data, exposure to the algorithms that we have, there is a danger that we are being rewired, if you will, in ways that we not necessarily understand, if you will, or at least comprehend at the time. I've always been interested in this question of how quickly people can change their beliefs on things. There's some interesting work where you could take a person who has been asked to judge the appearance of individuals on random pictures on a scale from 1 to 10. And then if you just tell them randomly after the fact is that 5 other people in a different room thought that the person was more attractive or less attractive, it turns out that number of if you show the picture, a similar picture of that person, maybe 5,000 images later on, where they probably don't remember that image per se, they will have actually changed their estimate of the appearance of that individual. It could be the case, though, that reported difference may have been a completely random thing. There may have been no other actual people out there, but it's the capacity of us to rewire our beliefs. So it's not like a calculation that, other people think this. It's more of we actually now change our beliefs because of a perception of what other people believe. And that's probably to do with our social nature, obviously. Our capacity to believe what others believe is one of the things that may have helped us, may not have, but at the end of the day, we are now playing with technologies who can manipulate those things in a very aggressive way. And I would view that as a kind of dehumanizing element in and of itself. So I would be very careful about how you would expose yourselves to the company of algorithms that are essentially geared towards driving people to certain behaviors. That's what they are meant to do. Clickbait, if you will, is out there. I would say that most of the major, big tech companies trying to convince people to buy, more of this and more of that, if you will. And as such, a lot of the research is going towards what I would consider a rewiring of people, which I would view as a form of dehumanization, if you will. So, whether or not the AI becomes a human element of itself and thus takes some of our humanity away or adds to it, I don't know, maybe they'll be the other way around. But I think there is definitely going to be changes in the way we exist if we just let things go the way they go.
Thank you for your answers. It's given us a lot to think about, but I think we'll have to stop there with the questions. So I just have a couple of things to say before we finish today. On your screen, you should be able to see details of a discount code, and I think also in the chat. So you can get 30% off this book. And if we haven't managed to get to your question today, then I would very much recommend reading it, because there's probably an answer in there or something to lead you to think about something else. So all you need to do is go to our website, www.worldscientific.com, find the book, and at the checkout, use this code, which is WS What is AI 30. The other thing that I need to do, of course, is to say a huge thank you to our speakers for giving us so much to think about, and also for the book as well, which you must use your discount code and read. And of course, thank you to everyone who has come to listen today. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. Well,
Thank you all.
Thank you, Natalia.
Thanks.
Thank you, Suman.
Thank you.